Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about how to set up accommodating resistance on band and chain work for your bench press. And this could be applied to your box squat, this could be applied to your deadlift and things like that. But the bench is one that a lot of people seem to be more interested in, and the bench is one that, particularly because it's normally we think of as a pause exercise, it's hardest off the chest. We need to talk a little bit about not losing strength at the bottom when setting up accommodating resistance. And a lot of it has to do with not going too heavy at the top relative to the amount of weight on the bottom. Now, we could apply this to other exercises. This could be applied to your deadlift. I think particularly this exact same topic works very well when talking about the deadlift. And to some extent, even the box squat, but it's hard to calculate unless you know your maxes on a box squat. It is hard to calculate that with bands and chains relative to your back squat. And again, this could be applied to a wide variety of exercises. It doesn't have to apply to just the bench press, but we're going to be specific about that because it is an exercise that people realize that 90% of us miss a bench press because of not enough power off the chest. And from a mechanical tension perspective, it's very, very obvious that that is where you're weakest on the bench press. So we get into this topic of understanding how to use these tools without losing that strength at the bottom. And a lot of it has to do with, number one, understanding why we're using accommodating resistance at all. And number two, understanding that the weight at the bottom matters more than the weight at the top for this. And what people need to keep in mind, a lot of times we're doing heavy accommodating resistance. We're not talking about speed work here either. That's its own topic. And it's going to be assumed that you're probably doing some speed work. So your normal heavy work, you have to pay attention to this even more, because the speed work, you're absolutely not getting a lot of stress at the bottom. It's more of a repeat effort. So we are trying to train ourselves to be more explosive at benching after we get the weight moving off of our chest. That's the whole idea. And it's used oftentimes to break up the law of accommodations. In other words, if you're rotating through different mild changes in the strength curve because of a modest amount of band tension or chains at the top, which is generally going to be in the range of 10%, maybe a little more, of what your real lifts are. In other words, if you're a 300-pound raw bencher, unless you have a good reason, you probably don't want to very frequently go more than about 330, 335 for your lockout at the top. We don't need to be adding hundreds of pounds, 100 pounds or more, to our lockout on the bench press for this sort of work. Because again, we're obviously stronger at the top. Like, I can tell you guys right now, if you were to go do some partials, a floorboard press or pen presses where you just move the weight a couple inches, you're going to be able to rep out 100 pounds more than your 1 rep max on the bench press, right? You're going to be able to take, if you're a 300 bencher, you're going to be able to put 400 pounds on there and do sets of 8 to 10 reps. But that's not the point. We're obviously stronger at the top, but what we are doing is that we are training ourselves to drive through and to maintain acceleration once we get the weight started explosively. And we're doing that by not using the weight that we normally explode with off the chest. We want it to be heavier than what we would be doing for max work. And conversely, if you were going to do 2s or 3s or 5s or whatever else with these, which some people will do as a training tool, these same rules apply, right? You're not necessarily trying to get more than your 1 rep max on that rep work at the top, but you do want it to be higher than your 3 rep max or your 5 rep max or whatever it is that you're doing from your weakest point in the lift. And again, it has to do with training yourself to continue to recruit higher threshold muscle fibers as you go up on the lift, because again, you're using a heavier weight than you would normally be moving through that range of motion, even with a max, especially on the top half. So what we're doing is we're training ourselves not to decelerate. We're training ourselves to maintain that power and speed that we develop out of the bottom so that we don't miss lifts. Because most of the time, the thing is, if you miss a lockout as a raw lifter, sometimes it's weak triceps. Other times it's the inability to follow through and continue to engage upper threshold muscle fibers because you fatigued yourself so much at the bottom. So if you train yourself to get used to continuing to drive through and having to lift fast, because especially with bands, if you slow down, you'll miss the lift because the bands will catch back up on you and they'll jerk you back down more. So chains are a little more forgiving on that than bands are. So you guys get the idea. And the point is we're trying to train ourselves to do that. But Here's the caveat. When we are trying to gain strength, true strength, not necessarily speed strength, but strength, we need to be within 90%. You don't get stronger off of singles that aren't at least 90% of your 1 rep max. You don't. Doesn't matter how many of them you do. Conversely, with reps, it's the same thing. So even if you're going to work with your 5 rep max, if you're just doing straight sets, if you at the bottom on your pause bench are not moving a weight off there that's at least 90% of your 5 rep max, right? Let's just work with 300 pounds. This is a good number just to use as a baseline. In other words, if you can bench 300 pounds as an all-out max, or real close to your absolute max, any singles that you do with less than about 270 to 275 off of your chest are not making you stronger at that point of where the most tension is placed on your pecs. It's not making you stronger there. So you can get as strong as you want in terms of joint angle specificity and neuromuscular efficiency and all of that at the top, right? You can get as strong as you want, but if you can't get the weight moving off the bottom, it's not going to matter. You're not going to get stronger. In fact, you're going to regress. And we could apply that same math to other rep maxes. So instead of thinking in terms of percentages of your 1 rep max, think in terms of percentages of your 5 rep max. If you're doing 5s, if you can do 300 for 5, anything less than 270 for your 5 rep sets off the chest is not going to stimulate the strength you need at those joint angles. It's not going to stimulate it. And again, if you're a raw bencher or you're trying to get a big chest from bench pressing, whatever your reasons for bench pressing, you have to be strong out of the bottom. And if you set up your accommodating resistance to where you're pushing so much weight at the top that you're forced to use a weight that's too light at the bottom. So let's say you get carried away. You get so into the accommodating resistance thing that you're doing, 40 pounds of reverse bands, 60 pounds of chains, all of this stuff to the point to where you're only benching 260 off the chest, but you're doing 340 at the lockout, but you were a 300 bencher and you do a bunch of singles with that, you don't do any additional work to make you stronger off the chest, you're going to stall. You're not only going to stall, but you might find that if you did nothing but that with no heavy pause bench above 270, you might find that when you do go test a pause bench again, that your max pause bench might drop to 285. It might drop to 290. And not because you aren't strong enough to follow through. You're going to follow through with that just fine. When you go and hit that 290, it's going to explode through the top. But when you go to 300 again, it's going to stick on your chest because you haven't done any heavy singles within 10% of that. Or you haven't even done any 5 rep sets that are within 10% of your 5 rep maxes. So you're not training those joint angles correctly. And again, the weakest part of the bench press, there's the most tension placed upon the pectorals. There's the most potential for muscle fiber recruitment in the pectorals down to the first inch or two. So when you're not moving that weight through there, you're going to tend to regress. And this is what you need to keep in mind. You don't need to necessarily have enormous amounts of accommodating resistance. You're not having to hit what would be your max lockout, because you're not even going to be able to do that with accommodating resistance. What you're going to be able to do off of a 4-inch range of motion pin press is probably going to be so much more than your max off the chest that you would be spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars in chains and stuff just to be able to add that type of weight, right? Because a lot of guys who do partial work find that real quickly, sometimes a 300-pound bencher eventually gets to where he could do reps with 500 pounds at the lockout if he were to do just partials. So that's the problem we run into with this, is that you can get too carried away with adding more to the top without realizing all we're trying to do is change our strength curve to where it gets gradually harder at the top. And for most purposes, even a 10% increase of the top weight versus the bottom and up to a 15 is going to work for most people. 20% is very aggressive. 20% is very aggressive, and it's a little more specialized. So in other words, if you've got 300 at the bottom, you probably are going to want to work with something in the range of about 330 to 345 at the lockout, right? 10 to 15%, somewhere in that sweet spot. If you start trying to hit 360 at the lockout when you have 300 on the bottom, that is a specialized training for someone who has tricep weakness and things like that. Right, that's a little more specialized. You probably are not going to need to do that to get the benefits of this style of training, or to just break up your movement patterns so that you can bypass the law of accommodating resistance for a slight change. So it's just like when you get to your bodybuilders talk about muscle confusion. This is literally the same thing. Just by changing the strength curve, instead of just doing your normal pause bench, to do bands or reverse bands that add a little bit of tension and have a couple different tensions of those, right? You can have one set of bands that adds 30 pounds and another set of bands that has 45 pounds at the top versus the bottom. And guess what? That's two different exercises. That's two different exercises in terms of strength curve and adaptation. All right, it's a novel training response relative to your primary bench and relative to each other. And then you do the same thing with chains. So what you're dealing with is slightly different novel exercises that have a different strength curve. But if you don't pay attention to the amount of weight that you have at the bottom, and you don't improve at that over time, you're going to regress on your actual real raw strength, and things like your pectorals are going to actually get weaker. And it's because you're simply not challenging them enough. You're not challenging them enough. And so that's the point I want to make with these lifts, is that you do need to pay very close attention to how much weight you are pulling at the bottom or pushing from the bottom when you are messing with your strength curves with things like bands and chains. Because if you don't, your raw lifts are going to regress. And we've seen that happen with guys who want to do the reverse band stuff and get a stronger deadlift. That's well and good. But if they've not been pulling anything more than 450 out of the bottom, it doesn't matter how much they lock out. Their max deadlift is probably going to be stuck at 500, even if they're locking out 600 or 650 at the top regularly with their reverse bands, because they haven't pushed the threshold of where they're probably weakest and have to recruit the most muscle fibers, the bottom. All right, guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.